the one that actually introduced the idea of the imitation game and the Turing test, there's an interesting, still showing up. Let's get this out of the way. Okay. In that very first paper where he's talking about whether or not a machine could genuinely be intelligent, the whole first part of the paper is the part that everyone knows about with the Turing test. But about halfway through that paper, he stops and changes his mind. He does a really new direction. And what he says is, instead of trying to produce a program that simulates the adult mind, why not rather try to produce one which simulates the child's? So at the very beginning, Turing has the insight that looking at children and looking at how children actually learn about the world would be important for trying to design AI. And that insight, which was sort of ignored for a very long time, people didn't even quote this part of the paper, has suddenly become much more relevant. If you look around, you'll find this quote all over the place. And the reason is that the great advances in AI over the last 10 years or so have come because of a focus on trying to design systems that will actually learn about the world rather than simply trying to build intelligence in the first place. And that's been the result of the advances in things like deep learning and reinforcement learning that have contributed so much to AI. So what I want to suggest is that we really should take this idea seriously, and I think increasing numbers of people are. But when we do, we come up against some interesting, come up against some interesting problems, and those problems are actually very ancient problems. So there's this very fundamental foundational problem in philosophy that I call the problem of knowledge. You could think of it as the problem of induction. And the problem is this. When we look at the knowledge that we have of the world, what we seem to see are hierarchical, structured, abstract representations of the world, and what's more, hierarchical, abstract, structured representations that are pretty accurate, and that seem to capture the nature of the world outside. But when you look at the information that comes to us from the world, it doesn't seem to have any of those characteristics. It seems as if it's concrete and particular and just consists of associations between particular kinds of events. So the problem is, how could we get to that abstract knowledge that lets us make so many novel predictions from that concrete data? And again, going back to the very beginnings, to Plato and Aristotle, there have been two ways of trying to solve that conundrum. So one way to solve it is to say, look, it only looks as if we're deriving that abstract knowledge from the data. In fact, we have that knowledge all along. And if you're Plato, it's in a past life. And if you're Descartes, it's in the mind of God. And if you're someone like an evolutionary psychologist, you think it's there from evolution. And if you're Noam Chomsky, you think it gets there through God as well. But essentially, the idea is that you start out with that kind of knowledge. You're not actually deriving it from the information at the data that you see. And the alternative, again, going all the way back to Aristotle, and then in the associationists, most recently in the new wave of machine learning, the empiricist view is to say, look, it only looks as if we have this kind of abstract hierarchical knowledge. If you look more carefully, you'll see that by simply putting together enough data, enough associations between enough specific events, then you can get all the same benefits that you seem to get from that kind of hierarchical structure. And I think to developmental psychologists like me, neither of those answers seems to be very satisfying, even though psychologists and philosophers have sort of ping-ponged back and forth between those two, and people in AI have ping-ponged back and forth between those two alternatives for thousands of years. Because when we actually look at children, what we see is that from the time they're born, they already seem to have these kinds of abstract hierarchical structures and knowledge about the world. But they also seem to revise and reshape and radically change those models in response to the evidence that they have around them. And Piaget, who of course was the great founder of cognitive development, articulated this idea by talking about constructivism. So he said, look, it isn't neither of these options is satisfactory. Unfortunately, when Piaget said that, that was just another way of saying neither of these options is satisfactory, because he didn't really have a good story about what could be happening instead. And I think this very general philosophical problem is being recapitulated in a lot of the very technical contemporary debates about AI. Because if you look at the current AI learning techniques, which are very much these empiricist techniques, what you see, things like deep learning, reinforcement learning, supervised learning, first of all, it needs enormous amounts of data. And actually the success of these techniques has depended on the fact that because of the internet, we have enormous amounts of data, and because of Moore's law, we have enormous amounts of compute power. And even though they're capable of matching things in the data, making predictions, they generally often don't make the right kinds of generalization from the data. And the wonderful thing about having abstract structure is that it lets you make generalizations. You can actually say, okay, now I'm going to make a prediction about something I haven't ever seen before. And the new systems often don't do much generalization at all. They tend to overfit to the data. That's the constant problem. And when they do, they often do it in ways that seem very unlike the ways that humans do. So something like ImageNet famously can discriminate between, say, pictures of cats and pictures of dogs. But you just change the texture of some of the pixels and it will misidentify a cat as a dog in a way that no human ever would. On the other hand, the really big advantage of these systems, the ideas in them are actually not terribly new, but as I said, because of Moore's law, they're computationally tractable. You can actually get them to work and you can scale them up without explosions. If you compare that to what we know about two-year-olds learning is kind of the opposite. There's relatively little data, and the kind of data that two-year-olds are getting is very different from the kinds of data that AI systems are getting. It's maybe a couple of objects moving around in a living room. And yet, even two-year-olds make excellent generalizations. And in fact, all of cognitive development research for the last 30 years has shown just how impressive the generalizations are that children make and how accurate they are by and large. And in particular, I'll go into more detail about this in a minute. The kinds of learning that children do turn out to be very well characterized as Bayesian inference of hierarchical probabilistic causal models. The problem is that even though we can sort of abstractly say that, what we could say is we give children a bunch of data and a choice of models and they pick the right one, there's this terrible problem, which is how is it that children are able to search through all those possibilities? As soon as you get a slightly complicated high-dimensional model, the amount of search you have to do to decide whether or not that model is correct, it just becomes enormous and exponential. And there are various kinds of sampling procedures that people have proposed to try and solve this, but even with good sampling procedures, it's still computationally intractable. It's very hard to see how you could actually solve that problem. Now, so the result is that people in AI recognize this. And in AI, there's an increasing attempt to try to use this information from developmental psychology as a basis for thinking about AI. And in particular, DARPA, the American agency that's been was behind inventing the internet and computers in the first place, has funded this big project to try and combine developmental psychology, the Machine Common Sense Project. And one thing that I learned from being with DARPA is that they love acronyms. So the Berkeley project is called MESS, which is appropriate for children. And what we argue is that there are three things that children do that current AIs don't that are crucial to getting the kind of intelligence that humans have. One of them is model building, actually building these abstract hierarchical structures from data. Another one is that they're exploratory. They actually have active learning. When children do this, we call it getting into everything. And they're also social learning systems, so they learn from others. And today I'm not going to talk about the exploratory or social learning parts, although they're very cool and we have a lot of interesting data about them. I'm going to focus on the model building part. Okay, so as I mentioned before, there's work that's been done in my lab and other labs over the last 20 years, which suggests that what I call the theory 2.0 is a good account of what children are doing. So back in the 80s, I and others made this argument that we could understand children's learning as being like theory formation in science. And theory formation in science is one of the great examples that we have of this kind of constructivist ability to create really novel hierarchical structure, things that we never would have thought of in the first place, based on, derived from data. And a kind of modern version of thinking about that theory formation, theory change, is the idea of thinking about constructivism as a matter of Bayesian inference of probabilistic models, and particularly causal models. So here's the idea. Children see a bunch of statistical data about the world, contingencies, but they interpret that data in terms of an abstract causal graph, a theory, a generative model of what the world is like. But rather than being deterministic, these models are probabilistic. So instead of just saying, okay, this is what the world is like, instead, the children are representing a number of different possibilities with different probability, and then they're using the data to decide which one of those is most likely, and then they can shift as new data. They'll shift that probability distribution as new data comes in. And what we've shown empirically is that 4-year-olds and younger, down to 18-month-olds, can infer a complex causal structure from conditional probabilities. They can infer unobserved structure. They can infer abstract hierarchical over hypotheses. They can infer theories. It's hard to find something that they're not good at doing. They can't do it for 100 variables at once, but and there are many things that they can do that are even more impressive, like infer new variables in some new work that we've done. Okay, so in this general framework, how does innateness play in to get to the particular point in this of this symposium? Well, if you're thinking about it in terms of this kind of framework, I think there are several different varieties of innateness that you might talk about. So, as I mentioned before, one of the great problems with this kind of Bayesian approach is the search problem. So how is it that we manage to search through all these possibilities? And one idea you might have is that there are innate constraints on the way that you search. You're only going to search certain possibilities. And someone like Elizabeth Spelke, most recently Josh Tenenbaum, has been doing this computationally, have argued that there's a kind of core knowledge. There's innate constraints on the possibilities that you're going to consider, and those constraints actually help to make the search feasible. So you're only going to think about certain kinds of physics, certain kinds of psychology, only certain kinds of options are available to you. And that, of course, is also Chomsky's view. So Chomsky's view of innateness basically has nothing to do with what you're born with. It has to do with the constraints you have on the possible grammars that you could have as adults. And that's true of a lot of nativist approaches. An alternative way of thinking about innateness, which is the one that we argued for back in Words, Thoughts, and Theories, my book in the late 90s, is instead to think about innate theories, essentially. So think that rather than starting with a blank slate, you start with initial models of the world, but those models are revised in the light of evidence, and they can be completely revised. They can be completely overturned in a kind of Otto-Neurath way. So you start out with a model, and then it can be completely overturned. And a third way of thinking about innateness, both of those initial ways sort of come from this deterministic Chomskyan tradition where you're going to only end up with one theory. But if you're thinking about this probabilistic distribution of possible theories or possible models, then another way to think about it is that you might start out with very peaked priors, as it were. What I mean by that is you might start out thinking that certain kinds of options are very, very likely, and other options are not so likely. And then as you get more and more data, you get more and more evidence, you could say, okay, I'm going to consider more different possibilities. And I think that's kind of the contemporary version of that innate constraints core knowledge view, is that you're going to start out really not considering very many options, and then you're going to sort of flatten out that distribution as you get more data. But notice that the opposite could also be true, and the opposite is more likely to be true in an AI system. You could start out without very strong assumptions. The sort of empiricist version of this would be to say, well, you start out with relatively flat priors, you consider lots of possibilities, and then as you get more data, you put more and more weight on the information that you already have. So in that kind of probabilistic models approach, you could think about the distinction between innateness and empiricism as really being this distinction about, are you going from more peaked to flatter priors, or are you going from flatter to more peaked priors? Okay, how could we find out whether any of this is true or not? Well, what we've done, how could we be making this big claim about the fact that these tiny little children are actually making these kinds of abstract inferences? Well, what we did was, instead of asking them about it, we invented this little machine. It's the blicket detector, and it does things, lights up and does things, plays music when you put some things on it, but not other things. And just using this very simple device, what we can do is show children different kinds of patterns of data, and then we can see what kinds of models they infer by asking them to activate the machine, or asking them which ones are blickets and which ones aren't. And as I mentioned, we've discovered, just using this simple system, that children are extremely good at inferring even really abstract events. And let me tell you about one whole set of work that we've done in this regard. This is with Tom Griffiths and Chris Lucas. And you can actually be participants in this experiment. So here's my blicket detector, and D goes on the detector and 3 times and nothing happens. And then E goes on and nothing happens. And then D and F together go on twice and the machine lights up. And the question is D a blicket? Is E a blicket? Is F a blicket? We'll let people quietly decide this in the privacy of their own Zooms. Well, you know, the most likely answer, if you're grown up, is to say, well, look, D is definitely not a blicket, nor is E. F is the only one that's a blicket there, because after all, D by itself isn't making the detector go. It's only making the detector go if F is there as well. But suppose you saw this sequence of events. So suppose you saw A, B, and C go on the detector and nothing happens. A and C together make the detector light up. A and B and C go on and nothing happens. You might think, if you saw this sequence, oh, wait a minute, I had the wrong general hypothesis about how this machine works. I thought it worked on a disjunctive individual principle. I thought it meant that either something was a blicket or not, and if it was, then it made the machine go. But it looks like the way this machine works is sort of an unusual abstract principle, which is that it's combinations that are necessary to make the machine go. It seems to work on a conjunctive principle. So A and C together are necessary to make the machine go. And that's another general hypothesis about the machine, but it's a much less likely one. So we started out this project just trying to see, could children infer these kind of abstract logical principles about a system, as well as inferring the specific inferences about what the specific objects did. So if you then went back and looked at that original sequence that I showed you, you might think, oh, wait a minute, if this is one of those combination machines, then D and F are both blickets, if it works on that general principle. So I hope that's reasonably clear. So what we did was we just did exactly what we did with you, with a range of participants of different ages. We gave them training either suggesting this disjunctive, sort of standard obvious disjunctive rule, or this unusual conjunctive rule, and then we gave them that ambiguous test that I showed you. So our first question was, would 4-year-olds be able to make the right kind of inference? And it turns out that 4-year-olds can. In fact, they're very good at that. As you'll see in a minute, if it's disjunctive, then they say it's disjunctive, but in the combination condition, they say that D is in fact a blicket. But the most striking thing was when we did this with adults, with undergraduates, they were much less good at inferring that abstract inference than the kids were. So the adults tended to stick with the obvious disjunctive inference, even when the data was against it. And then there was an interesting pattern I can maybe talk about more in discussion. You might think, well, maybe this is just because the adults have a lot more data than the kids do. So maybe that's just making them give a higher probability to the other alternative. So we went and looked at people in between. If you compare the preschoolers to the school-age children, the school-age children are less flexible than the preschoolers, but that continues all the way through adolescence. So it isn't just how many years you've been on the planet, but then there's a big significant shift in adolescence. And that suggests that there might be something intrinsic to being a child, something about maturation that's having this effect. And what you can see is if you look at this, move my cursor down here. If you look at a situation where you have the disjunctive one, you have evidence for the likely alternative, or you have no evidence at all in a baseline, you don't see those differences, but you do in the conjunctive case where it's the unusual hypothesis. So it looks as if the children are actually doing a better job of inferring this unlikely hypothesis than the adults. So this suggests that the right sequence is to think about a flatter prior, starting out with fewer assumptions, especially about these abstract ideas, and then relying more and more on the information you've already got and having a narrower set of options as you get older. And this actually idea, even though it was sort of surprising, actually fits with some ideas that I've been working on using the idea of life history, thinking about the evolution of childhood, another theme of this symposium. So one of the things that's really distinctive about humans, so life history is an important concept in evolutionary biology that I think should be the focus of much more attention in psychology and neuroscience. This is the life history of an animal is the way that its developmental life unfolds, how long a childhood it has, how much investment it puts in children, how long it lives overall, etc. And what you see is that humans have a really unusual life history. So by the time this chimp is in the Gombe is 7, that chimp is going to be producing as much food as he's consuming. And even in forager cultures, we don't do that until we're at least 15. So essentially, our childhood is twice as long as that of our closest primate relatives. And that childhood is really expensive. It means that those children are not only not producing, but we have an expanded range of caregivers compared to our closest primate relatives. So we not only have biological mothers taking care of babies, we have pair bonded fathers, we have allo parents, people who aren't biologically related. We have my personal favorite grandmothers, postmenopausal grandmothers. So very quickly, we seem to have adopted a whole bunch of costly investment to take care of these immature children. Why would that be? Well, what we see is that across a very wide range of different species, including in some recent work, even butterflies, you see this very striking relationship between life history, between the length of childhood and brain size and learning. So the poster animals for this are, if you compare this New Caledonian crow, the New Caledonian crow is incredibly smart animal, as smart as primates. Compare that to the chicken, the galliforms in general. The chicken is very good at doing a bunch of, and this I think is interesting. The chicken is very good at doing a few things very well, basically pecking for grain. And interestingly, empirical studies show that chickens can do the computations that you need to do this, which are often very complicated kinds of computations, from the time they're born. So people like Susan Carey have argued, oh, look, chickens can do complicated computations from the time they're born, so that shows that they're innate in people as well. But the important thing is that the chickens are really basically pretty stupid. They use those computations very well from the time they're born, precisely because they don't learn very much. They're not very good at taking new data from the world around them. If you compare that, so within weeks, chickens are mature. If you compare that to the crows, like humans, are fledglings or immature and incapable of taking care of themselves for as long as 2 years, which is a very long time. So if you're comparing the newborns, they look really stupid compared to the chickens. But the result is that they can learn about their environment in a creative way and do all these new things, like take a wire that they've never seen before and use it to make a tool to get food in a lab. So there seems to be this trade-off between having a lot of structure early, dedicated structure early on, versus not having that structure. You could think of the chickens as having this, the chickens have this kind of peaked to flat trajectory where they start out knowing a lot about specific things, and then maybe things like general associative learning mechanisms modify the things that they do, versus the crows, who seem to start out having something much more like this flat to peaked pattern, where they start out not making very many assumptions about what the environment is going to be like, but they're very good at learning about the environment. And you can see something like this if you look at brain development as well. So there's a slide adapted from famous work by Peter Huttenlocher. What you see is that early in development, you have this extremely plastic system, a system that changes a lot very easily, but that isn't very efficient. And then there are these real tipping points where you switch from having a system that's very good at changing, very good at extracting information from the environment, not very good at acting, to a system that's much more efficient and effective, but not as good at changing, not as plastic, not as good at detecting what's going on in the environment. And interestingly, if you just take a bunch of classes in university, you do a cognitive psychology class versus a cognitive development class, what you'll see is it's not just, okay, the cognitive psychology class is about grown-ups and the cognitive development class is about children. You'll see that the topics are completely different. So the kinds of things that adult cognitive psychologists point to, like attention, memory, planning, decision-making, those are not things that are a big focus in childhood, mainly because children are really terrible at doing all of them. Whereas a lot of the things that we focus on in childhood, statistical learning, grammar induction, conceptual change, those are not things that we see very much in adults. And I've argued that this is an example of a very general computational problem, which is the idea of the exploitation versus exploration trade-off. So the things that you need to be able to exploit to act effectively in the world, like narrow focus and long-term planning, are the opposite of the things that you need to be able to learn, which mean looking much more generally, exploring the world much more. And this is formally, provably, a trade-off that you can see in computation. And it's very hard, there's no simple way of resolving that trade-off. One kind of approach that often gets used in AI is called simulated annealing. And the idea is that you start out with this high temperature search. You start out exploring, looking at lots and lots of different options. That means that you're less likely to immediately get to a good option, but you might get a low probability, an initially low probability option, versus this low temperature search where you simply look close to the space that you're already in. And that has the advantage that you're quick to settle on a high probability answer, but there might be a better answer way off in the space and you're never going to get there if you're just doing this kind of cool low temperature search. So a very general strategy is start out exploring, then move to exploiting. Start out with this high temperature search and then gradually cool off to the low temperature search. And what I've suggested, this is in a new paper in Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, is that childhood is evolution's way of resolving this explore-exploit trade-off and performing something like simulated annealing. And from this perspective, a lot of things that are features from the explore perspective are bugs from the exploit perspective and vice versa. And many of the things about young children that people have traditionally seen as being cognitive limitations or cognitive defects, their noisiness, their variability, the kind of randomness they have, the fact that they take risks, that they're impulsive, that they play rather than work, that they're driven by curiosity. Although all those may be bugs from the exploit perspective, they're actually features from the explore perspective and vice versa. So the idea is that children's intelligence is this explore intelligence, quite different from the kind of intelligence that we typically think of in adults. And let me end by saying, okay, you could see that kind of idea would help to explain the Blicket detector experiments that I just told you about. If you're looking at high parts of space, you're more likely to get to these unlikely hypotheses like that combination hypothesis. But this idea about exploration and exploitation has also been used a lot in neuroscience and in AI in the context of reinforcement learning kinds of problems. So if you're trying to get a reward in reinforcement learning, you can either explore different kinds of options, which means that you might be missing reward, or you can exploit the option that you see is the most valuable to begin with. So Emily Lequin and I designed an experiment like this. So we took off from some work by Rich and Garekas. Am I missing a slide here? No, I guess that's right. All right, so here's the way this experiment works. What happens is that you see, you have something that looks like our Blicket detector. And what you do is put objects on the detector, but this time there's something riding on the object. So if the object is a ZAF, you get told you're going to get a sticker. And if the object is not a ZAF, you're going to lose 2 stickers. So you're looking for ZAFs. And you get to decide on each trial whether you're going to put the machine on or avoid it. So you can sort of see if you think that something's not a ZAF, you're going to get a loss, you should avoid putting it on. But of course, if you avoid putting it on, then you're never actually going to get the information that will tell you that you're never going to get the information that will tell you which are ZAFs and which aren't ZAFs. And what Rich and Gorak has found was that when you do this with adults, they fall into what they call a learning trap. So what happens is that because adults are avoiding the potentially negative outcomes, they don't get the information they need to learn the rule. And in particular, in this kind of an experiment, what happens is, kind of like the previous case, is the obvious hypothesis about the system is it's a one-dimensional rule. So it's that stripes are things with spots are ZAFs and things with stripes aren't ZAFs, or black things are white things are ZAFs and black things aren't ZAFs. But the actual rule in this case is this more complicated two-dimensional rule. So this is the only one that isn't a ZAF if it's got black stripes on it. And the question is, could you infer that rule? And what we found was that the adults in this kind of experiment, just as in Gorakis's experiment, tended to go with a one-dimensional rule, and that meant that they left a bunch of reward behind on the table. The children, on the other hand, because they were children, they were impulsive, they wanted to see what was going to happen, were much more likely to approach the objects. So they got much more information. And then when we actually asked about the rule, what's the rule that makes this machine go, what we found was that the children were much better at actually accurately inferring that unlikely rule than the adults were. So the fact that the children were impulsive, that they were willing to take the loss in order to get information, meant that they actually had this advantage in learning. And in particular, they had the advantage in learning the unlikely hypothesis, and learning, as it were, the thing that's in the non-stationary distribution of environments. And we replicated that and did controls and all the rest of it. I won't go into all the details of that. Okay, so I hope what I've convinced you of is that the way to think about innateness is not just in terms of innate constraints on the search space. And even that in some sense, if you're thinking about this peak to flat distinction as being a way of trying to capture innateness in a probabilistic Bayesian context, at least in part, the evidence is as good for an initial assumption in children that's looking at a wider range of options and then narrowing down with the data as it is in the other direction. Now, again, it may very well be that this is different in different domains. So we humans may be like chickens when it comes to, say, our visual system, where we start out with very strong assumptions that we only gradually change. But for causal inference, it looks as if what's happening is that children are actually able to approach a much wider range of options than adults. And that might be an important clue to what we need to do to get AI systems that can deal with the wide range of novelty in the environments that we know that children can. So let me mention my collaborators on this and the funders, and stop and take some questions.
Thank you for the talk, Alison. Now we have time for questions, and we have one question already in the Q&A section. Question from Johan Trish is, do participants know how many trials there will be? And does this influence their willingness to explore?
Yeah, so one question is it, you could make different rational decisions based on how long your time horizon is. And one idea is that part of the reason why you see this explore first, exploit later is that as you get further on, your time horizon is going to be shorter. And yes, the participants do know, both the children and the adults, that there's going to be 4 rounds of this, 4 rounds of these examples. And maybe I should mention as well, I should put up a slide about this. It's interesting, just in the past couple of years, this isn't just in our lab, there's been 3 or 4 other studies showing the same, using kind of reinforcement learning paradigms, and showing that the children are more exploratory than the adults are.
Okay, so thanks for making this talk. Okay, thanks. Thank you for the talk, and I have a question related to the actually this pattern that you showed about how this linked experiment, how the way it is processed by children of different age changes, and when adults are actually the worst of all. It looks like it kind of abruptly, the performance, let's say, abruptly decreases at the more or less the adolescent stage.
Right.
Do you actually maybe have any specific theory why adolescent time, maybe like the specific moment when the way people interpret this pattern changes?
Well, in the neuroscience literature, it's interesting that there's one of the ideas in the AI literature. I mentioned this simulated annealing, and often the best way to do this is to have multiple rounds of annealing. So you heat up, then you cool off, then you heat up again, then you cool off. And if you look in the neuroscience literature, there's, I think, quite a bit of evidence that there's kind of this reburst of plasticity in adolescence, but it's in the context of social learning. And finding I didn't have a chance to talk about is that when we give this kind of physical task about the causal inference, you see the adolescents looking just like the adults. But when we did the same thing, but now with a social task where you have to get an unlikely social hypothesis, the adolescents are actually the most flexible. So what you see is the 4-year-olds are really flexible. It goes down in school age, and then it goes way up again in adolescence, and then it goes down in adulthood. So I think what's happening is, I do think that there's some neuroscience evidence that the physical changes in adolescence are causing this brain change. And I think what's happening is it's kind of freezing the parts that you already know about, like the physical world, but then it's inducing more plasticity for things like social understanding, which kind of makes sense from the adolescent perspective.
I see. Thank you very much.
I think we have a question from Thomas Dietrich. So,
hello. Yes. So thank you very much for that lovely talk. These are fascinating topics. I'm very sympathetic to the Bayesian perspective here, but it's always been a challenge when I want to write down a prior probability distribution to represent the prior. I need to choose some vocabulary. And what are my variables? And similarly, when I'm doing causal modeling, I need to decide, well, what are the causal factors and give them names. Do your experiments or what are your thoughts about the role of are those representations innate in some sense, or are they also learned?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's funny because this is actually literally our most recent paper. I can send a link to it with Marielle Gadou in developmental psychology that just came out. We wanted to ask exactly that question. So how do you decide which causal variables are relevant? And what we showed was that children use difference making, as philosophers would say, as an indicator of which variables are generally ones you should pay attention to. So what we did was introduce a situation where there's two different potential variables, color and shape. And what the children first see is that one of those is making a difference in one causal context, and the other one is just not making a difference. And now when they get a new causal context, they immediately think that the variable that made a difference before is now going to be the one that you should test in this completely novel context. So, it's a laboratory experiment, but it suggests that there's a bootstrapping between seeing what is making a causal difference and then picking that out as a variable that you would consider in the next round of your causal inference, because of course it is a problem about which ones you should pay attention to. And I think my general picture is, if you think about some of these things like visual perception, you could think about visual perception as initially picking out, that's sort of like the innate starting state theory. Here's a bunch of things that you should be paying attention to. But if you're also trying to build causal models, one of the things that we also showed even earlier is that children, for instance, would infer that there was an unobserved variable, something that you hadn't actually seen, but that you had to posit to explain the pattern of causal interactions. And then they would go out and try and figure out what that variable was. So I think you do have to start with some kind of vocabulary to get these models off the ground. It can't be just sort of pure data. But I think we have a couple of experiments and principled examples of how you can actually revise the variables that you consider given the the data that you have in a rational way.
Thank you.